Hi guys, it's Lucy. Today I have a science fiction recommendation for you, and the title is The Three Body Problem, and it's by a Chinese author. His name is Liu Cixin. This book has been recommended to me over the past 2-3 years by at least three different people. And I read it this month, and I think if you are only going to read one science fiction book of the year, this is a great one to start with. It's the first book of a series, of a trilogy, I believe. So I haven't read the other two, but I think even the first book by itself on a standalone basis is a very, very thrilling ride. So there are three things that really struck out to me that I wanted to mention as to why I would recommend it and why I like it. So the first reason that I would recommend this book is the historical context and background. So of course it was a book that was originally written in Chinese and translated into English. The fact that this was set in, or part of the book was set in the 1950s, 60s when China was going through the Cultural Revolution, right in the deep turmoil of intellectuals and scientists being criticized and sent away into the countryside and villages to do manual hard labor. The way that he ties it in with one of the characters and the background of this project, the science project and army base, all of that combined together is something that I think a lot of Western readers wouldn't really get exposure to, especially perhaps people who read science fiction. So this this by itself gives you that context in a really fun way. So it's really unexpected reading Chinese culture in a science fiction setting. So I really enjoyed that because this is the reality today, where a lot of people who are working in the field either have experienced that kind of background directly through, in their family tree, or indirectly. People making decisions today, this was part of their lives. So it's not made up, it's part of reality today, but in a science fiction setting, which is, it's very light, it's sprinkled throughout, but that kind of political background is there, and it's something new to the genre. So the second thing that I really like about this book is how he wove in actual scientific concepts and background. So beyond just the normal, it took decades for the message to be received. It's going to take decades for us to hear back if there are, extraterrestrial intelligence sending messages back to us, just because of the distance in light years. Beyond that, the way that he framed the idea of a world out there having three suns and how that impacts their climate, and the idea of dehydrating bodies, the idea of just volatile environments, and another civilization's pursuit of that issue, because that climate issue, and also towards the end of the book, the development of their approach on how to attack Earth in a scientific way, through limiting dimensions, through SOFON. So not giving anything away, but these are all very, very cool things that are explained in a quasi pseudo science way that makes the genre quite fun and cool to read about. Even though I think in those more conceptual parts, I was skimming a little bit more, or having to reread a little bit more. But I think for a science fiction book, not a lot of science fiction that I've read growing up in the past few years incorporated as much science in such an imaginative way. So the level of creativity is really high in this book. The third thing and the last thing that I really like is obviously the moral aspects presented. So it's not your usual humans versus ET all-out warfare. It talks about whether or not perhaps another civilization could make better use of Earth's resources, which is just a little bit of, I think it's too much to imagine that if ET exists, there would be factions on Earth where part of our civilization might want another civilization to take over or rule above us, or maybe even willingly be eliminated because they've come to believe that we are parasites on Earth. Like, that's a really strong statement. But the idea that we might not even agree on how to deal with aliens is very realistic if we look at just bipartisanship in the world's major democracies. How are we going to deal with it? And another thing is the fact that if we're so worried about being attacked in all of these imagined scenarios, not just this one, but basically every single sci-fi situation almost, why are we sending out messages in the first place in hopes that contains all of the best parts of our discoveries and our culture? Why are we doing that? Are we so hopeful as to have a peaceful existence when we ourselves can't even stave off warfare for long enough that it doesn't hit the news cycle every single year? Somewhere in the world there's always a war. Why do we think that it's going to be different involving another universal intelligent race? So a lot of these type of contradictions that I don't really know what the answers are, but it's just interesting to contemplate. So I really enjoyed reading this book, and I look forward to reading the rest of the two in the trilogy, and I'll report back on how I feel. But I'm really glad that this was translated in such a fluid manner. I was afraid, hesitant to pick up translated works, especially translated from languages like Japanese or English, because sometimes I feel it doesn't flow as well. But I think the translator, Ken Liu himself, is a writer, and he kept a lot of the aspects or logic that when I read it, I can feel the foreignness of it, but I still understand fully. And I think that's the best way to read a work that's been translated, where you don't feel like it's been completely changed to read like something native, but it still makes perfect sense, and you can still feel and understand the characters. One weakness that I heard about in another YouTube review is about the lack of emotional depth in the characters, and I think that might be a cultural thing, because when I read it, I feel that these characters are fully colorful, expressed in full. So maybe it's a cultural thing, which would be another novel thing to get exposed to. I don't think it was done intentionally that these characters are so cold in like one way or another. I think these are quite realistic. So I'm not sure if it's because I'm Chinese and I understand these conversations and a little bit more, but I feel that's a really interesting point that someone else have picked up that I completely missed. So let me know if you've read this book and how you feel about it. I'd be really interested to find out. Thanks, and have a good week, everyone.